The man who was supposed to meet her was not there. The steam engine hissed its final, weary breath, and the platform of the Harmony Creek station in the Nevada Territory filled with the clatter of boots and the calls of men greeting their families. But for the woman in the dark green dress, there was only a wall of strange, pale faces and a silence that felt louder than the train itself. She stood perfectly still beside a small, carved wooden chest, her hands folded neatly at her waist. The dress was made of a fine, heavy silk that seemed to absorb the dusty afternoon light, its high collar framing a face that was a mask of composure. Yet Arthur Vance, watching from the shade of the telegraph office, saw the slight tremor in her hands. He saw the way her eyes scanned the crowd, once, twice, and then a third time, with a flicker of something that looked dangerously close to panic. Arthur had only come to town for a sack of flour and some salt, a trip he made once a month from his failing homestead 8 miles out. He had no business with the goings-on at the station. But the whispers started, low and sharp like the buzz of horseflies. He caught snippets from the men loitering near the loading dock. A mail-order bride, they said, for Jebediah Stone, a miner up at the silver claim, a man known more for the weight of his fists than the contents of his character. And now, it seemed, a man who couldn't even be bothered to collect the woman he'd sent for across an entire ocean. The station master, a portly man with a sweat-stained collar, approached her. "Ma'am?" he asked, his voice impatient. She did not respond, her gaze fixed on the empty space where a welcoming face should have been. "I said, ma'am, this is the end of the line. You can't just stand here." He gestured vaguely with his thumb. "You got someone coming?" She finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. She spoke a few words in a language that sounded to Arthur like the rush of a river over smooth stones, soft but swift. The station master just scowled. "I don't know what that is. English. Do you speak English?" She shook her head, a small, tight movement. The humiliation was rolling off her in waves now, a heat shimmer in the dry air. The crowd was thinning, but a few onlookers remained, enjoying the spectacle. Arthur felt a familiar, unwelcome knot tighten in his gut. It was the same feeling he got when he saw a horse mistreated or a fence line cut by a spiteful neighbor. It was the feeling of something wrong that needed righting. "She with you?" the station master called out, his eyes landing on Arthur, one of the last men lingering. Arthur pushed himself off the wall. He was a tall, lean man, weathered by the sun and work, with clothes that were more patched than original fabric. "No, sir, she's not." "Well, I can't have her cluttering up my platform. Stone was supposed to be here at noon. It's nearly 4. He turned back to the woman. "You got money for a ticket back?" She stared at him, her incomprehension a clear and solid thing between them. He sighed, throwing his hands up. "Right. I'll telegraph the marshal in Carson City. We'll sort it out tomorrow." He started to walk away, leaving her standing alone as the last of the afternoon sun beat down on the tracks. Arthur looked at her, then at his own worn boots. He had $3 to his name, a cabin that let the wind in, and a piece of land that had given him nothing but heartache since his wife passed. He had absolutely nothing to offer a stranger. But to leave her there, to be passed along like freight, felt like a kind of cruelty he couldn't stomach. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. The few remaining townsfolk watched with open curiosity. He stopped a few feet away, careful not to crowd her. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect his father had drilled into him. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, met his. There was fear in them, but beneath it a strength that surprised him. She held his gaze without flinching. He didn't know what to say. He had no words that she would understand. He looked at the perfect stillness of her posture, the neatness of her folded hands, the precise collar of her dress. Then his gaze fell to his own shirt sleeve, where a long, gaping tear ran from the elbow to the cuff, a casualty of a run-in with a barbed wire fence that morning. An idea, born of pure desperation and practicality, took root in his mind. It was a foolish, absurd idea, but it was the only one he had. He pointed to the tear on his sleeve. He looked her directly in the eye, his voice low and earnest, as if the sincerity of his tone could bridge the gap between their languages. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "can you sew?" She blinked. Her gaze followed his finger to the ripped fabric of his shirt. For a long moment, she just looked at it. A flicker of something crossed her face. Surprise, perhaps, or confusion. Then her eyes rose back to his. She gave a single sharp nod. The wagon ride to his homestead was silent, broken only by the creak of the wheels and the jingle of the harness. He had loaded her small chest onto the back, and she sat beside him on the buckboard, her back as straight as a fence post. She did not look at him, but instead watched the dusty, sun-baked landscape roll by, her expression giving nothing away. Arthur felt the weight of his decision settle on him. What had he done? He'd brought a stranger, a woman from another world, to a place that was barely a home. When they arrived, he saw his property through her eyes. The cabin was a simple one-room structure of rough-hewn pine, solid enough, but weathered to a silver gray. The corral fence sagged in one corner, and the barn door hung crooked on a single hinge. It was a place of stark survival, not comfort. He helped her down from the wagon and carried her chest inside. The interior was clean but spare. A bed in one corner, a small cast-iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding his meager supplies. He gestured around the room. "This is it," he said, though he knew she wouldn't understand the words. She stood in the center of the room, her gaze taking in every detail. She ran a hand over the rough wood of the table, then looked at the single window, which was covered by a thin, tattered piece of burlap that did little to keep out the dust. Finally, her eyes landed on him. She gave him another one of those quick, decisive nods, as if she had assessed the situation and found it acceptable. That evening, after a quiet meal of beans and cornbread, he remembered his torn shirt. He took it off, leaving him in his undershirt, and handed it to her. "Here," he said, pointing again at the tear. She took the garment and examined the rip with a practiced eye. From her wooden chest she produced a small, embroidered silk pouch. Inside was a collection of needles of varying sizes, spools of fine thread, a small, sharp pair of scissors, and a silver thimble. Sitting at the table in the lamplight, she went to work. Arthur watched, mesmerized. Her hands moved with a speed and precision he had never seen. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. The needle became an extension of her fingers, dipping and rising, weaving the torn edges of the coarse cotton back together. The stitch she used was tiny, nearly invisible. It wasn't a clumsy repair. It was a restoration. In less than half an hour she was done. She folded the shirt neatly and handed it back to him. He took it and held it up to the light. He had to search for the tear. Where there had been a gaping hole, there was now a seam so fine and strong it looked like it had always been there. He ran his thumb over it. It was smoother than the rest of the shirt. He looked from the mended fabric to her face. She was watching him, her expression calm. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. He didn't know her name, so he pointed to himself. "Arthur." Then he pointed to her, a question in his gesture. "Lynn," she said. Her voice was soft, but the word was clear. "Lynn," he repeated. It was a good name. It felt solid, like she did. The next day they went back to town. They needed more than just flour now. They needed fabric, thread, and other provisions. When they walked into Abernathy's general store, the chatter stopped. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, polished the counter with a rag. "Vance," he said, his gaze flicking to Lynn and back again. "Didn't figure on seeing you again so soon." "Need some supplies, Abernathy," Arthur said, ignoring the tone. As Arthur gathered flour, coffee, and beans, Lynn moved silently through the store. She paused at the bolts of fabric, running her fingers over the calico and gingham. Abernathy watched her like a hawk. "Finding everything you need?" he asked Arthur, his voice laced with insinuation. "Seems you've taken on new help." "She's a guest in my home," Arthur said, his voice level but cold. "A guest," Abernathy repeated, savoring the word. "That what Stone'll call her when he comes looking?" Before Arthur could respond, Lynn spoke. She said something in her own language, her tone sharp, and pointed to a bolt of blue calico. Then she shook her head and pointed to another, a drab brown muslin. She held up the edge of the muslin, pinching the fabric between her fingers and rubbing it, showing how loosely it was woven. Then she looked directly at Abernathy and said one clear English word. "Bad." Abernathy's face flushed. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, who had been examining buttons nearby, looked over with interest. Lynn had just, in front of a customer, questioned the quality of his goods. "Now see here," Abernathy began, but Lynn simply turned away from the inferior fabric and selected a bolt of sturdy, unbleached canvas and another of a simple, dark blue cotton. She brought them to the counter and looked at Arthur, indicating that this was what she needed. Arthur paid for the goods, the coins making a loud clink on the wooden counter in the silent store. As they left, he could feel every eye in the place on their backs. He knew then that bringing her to his homestead had not solved her problem. It had only made her part of his. Back at the cabin, the tension from town lingered in the air. That evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, Lynn took down the wretched burlap sack from the window. With the canvas they had bought, she began to measure and cut. She didn't have a large table to work on, so she spread the fabric on the clean-swept floor. Arthur sat and watched her, the rhythmic snip of her scissors a comforting sound in the quiet room. He finally asked the question that had been sitting on his chest for 2 days. He gestured toward the town. "Jebediah Stone," he said, saying the name slowly. He pointed at her, then made a questioning gesture. Lynn stopped her cutting. She understood. She went to her wooden chest and took out a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, written in English. She handed it to him. Arthur unfolded it. The handwriting was a rough scrawl full of misspellings. It spoke of a wife to cook and clean and keep his house. It promised passage and a new life. There was not a single word of kindness or welcome in it. It was a bill of sale for a person. He folded the letter and handed it back to her. He felt a slow burn of anger on her behalf. He looked around the sparse cabin, at the life he'd been living, a half-life of grief and solitude. He walked over to the wall above his bed. There was a small, faded rectangle on the pine boards, a slightly lighter patch where a picture frame had hung for years. He'd taken it down a year ago, unable to bear the daily reminder. He touched the empty space. "My wife, Sarah," he said, his voice thick, "and our son, Thomas. The fever. 2 winters ago." Lynn looked from his face to the empty spot on the wall and back again. She didn't offer empty gestures of pity. Instead, she gave a slow, solemn nod of understanding. It was a shared acknowledgement of loss, a quiet recognition that they were 2 people who had been left behind by the lives they were supposed to have. In that moment, something shifted between them. The space was no longer just his cabin and she his temporary ward. It was a shared shelter. The next day, Lynn finished the curtains. They were simple, practical panels of canvas, but they hung straight and true, blocking the harsh sun and giving the room a sense of privacy it had never had before. When they were up, she stood back and looked at them, a small, satisfied smile touching her lips for the first time. The cabin felt more like a home already. But she wasn't done. She took the blue cotton fabric and, using one of his old, worn-out shirts for a pattern, she began to craft him a new one. She worked for 2 days, her needle flying. The result was a shirt that fit him better than any he had ever owned, with strong, double-stitched seams and a collar that sat just right. When he put it on, the fabric felt solid and clean against his skin. It was the first new piece of clothing he'd had in 3 years. Her quiet industry spurred him on. While she sewed, he worked outside. He repaired the corral fence, rehung the barn door, and cleared the stubborn sagebrush that was trying to reclaim his small pasture. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt a flicker of purpose. He wasn't just surviving the days, he was building them. One afternoon, a wagon rumbled up the path. It was not a familiar sound. Arthur came out of the barn, his hand resting on the handle of his pitchfork. A large, barrel-chested man with a florid face and a belligerent stance climbed down. He was dressed in miner's clothes, caked with mud and dust. "You Vance?" the man bellowed. "I am," Arthur said, not moving from the barn doorway. "I'm Jebediah Stone. I'm here for my property." His eyes scanned the homestead, taking in the mended fence and the new curtains in the window. A sneer twisted his lips. "Looks like she's been keeping busy." The cabin door opened and Lynn stepped out. She stood on the small porch, her hands held loosely at her sides. Her face was calm, but her eyes were like chips of flint. Stone grinned, a humorless baring of teeth. "There she is. Get your things. You're with me now." Lynn didn't move. She said something in her own language, her voice low but carrying clearly in the still air. The tone was unmistakable. It was a refusal. Stone's face darkened with rage. "Don't you try that gibberish on me. You belong to me. I paid your passage." He started toward the porch. Arthur stepped forward, blocking his path. He was leaner than Stone, but he stood his ground. "She is not your property, Stone. She's a free woman, and she's a guest in my home. You're not welcome here." "Get out of my way, farmer," Stone snarled, shoving a thick finger into Arthur's chest. "This ain't your concern." "She made it my concern when you left her standing on that platform." Stone laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I was busy. A man's got work to do. She's here to work for me." He tried to push past Arthur, but it was Lynn who ended it. She took a step forward, and in her hand she held her sewing shears. They were small, but the steel blades glinted in the sun. She did not raise them like a weapon. She simply held them, a symbol of her skill, her hands, her new life. She looked Stone dead in the eye and spoke again, this time in slow, deliberate English, words she must have been practicing. "I am not yours," she said. The 3 words hit with the force of a physical blow. Stone stared at her, then at Arthur, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He had been publicly defied by a woman he considered less than a servant, and sheltered by a man he considered a failure. His pride was wounded, which made him dangerous. "This ain't over," he spat, his gaze promising retribution. He climbed back onto his wagon and whipped the horses into a gallop, leaving a cloud of dust and hatred hanging in the air. The summer heat gave way to the crispness of autumn. The threat from Jebediah Stone never materialized. Word came down from the mining camp that he'd gotten into a dispute over a claim, tried to cheat his partner, and was run out of the territory by a U.S. Marshal who had no patience for claim jumpers. Harmony Creek breathed a collective sigh of relief, and the story of how Arthur Vance and the Chinese woman had faced him down became a piece of local legend. The change in the town's attitude was slow but steady. It started when Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, stopped by with a loaf of freshly baked bread, ostensibly to welcome her new neighbor. She saw the inside of the cabin, the neat curtains, the bright quilt now covering the bed, a masterpiece of color and pattern that Lynn had crafted from dozens of tiny scraps, and the tidy shelves. She left with a new respect for the quiet woman who had transformed the place. Soon, other women from the town began to find reasons to ride out to the Vance homestead. They brought offerings of eggs or jam, and in return, they would ask Lynn's advice on a difficult stitch or commission her to mend a precious piece of clothing. Her hands became famous. She could save a lace collar, patch a woolen coat so the repair was an artful part of the design, and craft a child's dress that was both sturdy and beautiful. She never charged much, but the small amounts of coin and the goods she received in trade filled their pantry. With the home secure, Arthur's work on the homestead thrived. He bought a dozen laying hens with the money Lynn had earned, and their eggs became a steady source of income. He rebuilt the barn properly and acquired 2 milk cows. The land that had seemed so barren began to feel generous. One cool evening in late October, Arthur sat at the table, watching Lynn stitch the hem of a new apron. The cabin was filled with the warm, golden light of the lantern and the comforting smell of beef stew simmering on the stove. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was a place of warmth and life. He looked at his hands, calloused and stained from his work, and then at hers, so nimble and sure. He got up and went to his trunk at the foot of the bed. From it he pulled out the first shirt she had ever mended for him, the one with the tear from the barbed wire fence. He had kept it, neatly folded. He ran his thumb over the impossibly fine seam. It was a reminder of that first day, of a desperate question asked on a train platform. He brought the shirt to the table and laid it down beside her. She looked up from her work, a question in her eyes. He didn't have the words to explain all the things that had changed in his heart, all the gratitude and respect he felt for her. So he just touched the mended seam with his finger. "You fixed more than just a shirt," he said, his voice quiet. A soft smile touched her lips. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the mended cloth. She didn't need to say anything. In the quiet cabin, surrounded by the home their hands had built together, the silence was full of understanding. It was a foundation stronger than stone, stitched together with thread and tenacity. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.